You're listening to MedX, the Medical Extrusion Podcast, presented by U.S. Extruders. Extrude with confidence, custom extrusion equipment designed for you and your application.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Tilak Shah, who will talk about polymer material and process selection for medical devices. Tilak, thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Steve, for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you on. It's an honor to have you on, Tilak. And before we get started, if you could go through your background, I think that would be interesting for people.
Yeah, Steve, I have spent over 50 years with the polymers and the medical device industry. My journey started with working at Upjohn company. Upjohn had a polymer chemical division, and I joined then in their thermoplastic polyurethane group. That's where we were developing thermoplastic medical grade products called Palathane 2363, which been in the market for over 50 years now, or at least 45 plus years. And it's still doing very strong. After I left Upjohn, I started my consulting company, and then also founded the company called Polymer that's going to be doing the contract manufacturing work. So about 30 years I spent with Polymer. Since 4 years, I'm retired now, traveling with my wife, doing some consulting. But also I'm teaching a couple of classes at NC State. Their biomedical engineering programs, and similar thing at Duke. Basically, their biomedical engineering students, at the end of the year, they have to submit the prototype. So my lecture on the polymer chemistry and polymer processing really helped them come up with the right polymer and right processing for their prototype devices.
Well, that's a perfect segue to what we're going to talk about today, right? And but before we do that Palathane 2363, being involved in that or part of that team to develop that material, all these years later, it must be rewarding to know that millions and millions of pounds have been used of that material in med tech,
That's
right?
correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's right. And that's what also brings a lot of my consulting clients, because anytime they get stuck on any polyurethanes or any kind of, sort of polymer that matters, they reach out, and whichever way I can help them, I do help them.
Okay. Then, of course, Polymer, a great company. You really you founded that company, and I know your sons helped you build it. And congratulations on the recent acquisition.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's get started, Tilak. I want to talk about polymer material selection for devices, and then we'll talk about processes. And during the process, I want to focus on the dip molding part of it. But for the polymer selection, one of the things that we talk about all the time in med tech is the durometer materials, and I want to focus on that a little bit as well. But before we start, I'm going to share a slide that kind of helps, I think, the listeners go through some of the parameters in identifying which polymer to use for a particular device. So if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen.
Sure, please.
Okay.
Oh, yes. This slides I developed really helping my customer at Polyzen, because many a times they come up with a device and they say device is not working or not doing the job it's supposed to do and help us. And my first question is, what are the critical functional requirements of this device? And they look at me and say, what do you mean? So finally, we developed this list where people need to put down what they are trying to do. So the very simple basic thing, I start with what this device is supposed to do, whether it's a diagnostic device or therapeutic device. It's a short-term use or long-term use, because depending on the short-term and long-term use, you have to choose specific type of polymers for the long-term use. Many a times sterilization process, because if they need to gamma sterilize this process and not ET or anything else, then again, the selection of polymers need to be considered slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
We also focus on what part of body this device is going to come in contact with, blood or biofluid or skin.
Mm-hmm.
Because later you also have to do some biocompatibility testing to make sure it's functioning the way it's supposed to function, and it's a biodurability under the actual use conditions is suitable for that particular polymers.
Mm-hmm.
Last but not least is always we focus on volume and a price point.
Right.
Because many a times in prototype conditions, we can develop the device from the whatever material available in the lab. And half of the times it works, but either it's too expensive or it's not suitable for the mass scale production. So knowing the device volume and price point, we can help select the right materials and right processes.
Right.
Get to my next slide. At least that will give you the how many material processing choices you have. Here, the whole number of polymers are broken down by their properties or the nature.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it's plastics, hard plastics, elastomers, and rubber. Rubber are mostly the thermoset. And most of these polymers one can use for biomedical application, as long as they are biocompatible in the environment they are going to be using. Hardness, what you mentioned, maybe if I can go to the next slides.
Yeah, definitely.
We can define here, hardness is defined by the shore hardness. Shore hardness is a scale D is used for the harder polymer, scale A used for the softer polymers. And here you can see scale A from 45 to 75, 80 are the softer materials are there. Further you go down, D scale start from 35, 40D all the way to 80D.
Okay.
And between 70 to 80D, that's where the higher hardness plastic starts.
Okay.
Let's move to my next one.
Yeah, this is interesting. I'd like to talk to you to add some about the chemistry here. Very good.
Because many a times people ask what makes this polymers softer or harder.
Mm-hmm.
And especially this kind of question comes more for the selection of polyurethane, because urethane chemistry is such where they offer softer polymer as well as a harder polymers. What happens is that every polymer is combination of the many monomers and reaction. And some monomers are like a string type, very, very soft, and they make it a soft, elastic, rubbery kind of polymers. And some monomers are very hard, like a stick.
Okay.
Which make a harder plastic. So if you take an example of, a polycarbonate used for the safety helmet, it's very hard. It has all stick, very stiff monomers.
Okay.
And when you combine stick and rope or the soft segment and hard segment, depending on what proportion you have, you can make in between low to medium diameter materials. So if you have a majority of the hard segment and lower soft segment, they make a medium to hard kind of polymers. And if you have a more soft segment and less hard segment, then they are lower to the medium hard segment. And that's how polyurethane or P bags kind of materials you can have from shorty 35
Yeah.
to shorty 72, and it covers the whole range of the hardness.
Yeah. Polyurethane's a perfect example of that, right? Where you could
That's
have the hard segments and the more soft
right.
segments for the more compliant materials.
Right. And then they also have a special grade in polyurethane called isoplast,
Yes.
which is 100% hard segment,
Okay.
which is a really simulate the very hard steel kind of products.
Okay.
So knowing what your device need to be flexible, hard, you can make a selection of those right polymers.
Can you give us a couple examples of products that would be, or components that would be manufactured from, we'll do three things, maybe hard materials, kind of medium, and then really soft, ultra soft, just a kind of example of some components.
Sure. The typically hard materials people use for hubbing of the catheters, or if you want to do the catheter handles,
Mm-hmm.
then those kind of things are made from the hard product. Also, if you have housing for any console, you need
Yeah.
the harder material. There are a lot of electronics they're just putting into the device. Again, you need some hard material. So it's a good example. Typically nylon 11, nylon 12 they use for hubbing.
Yep.
ABS polycarbonate is used for the hubbing. Many times people use polypropylene also for the hubbing. It's depend on what device and what they want to do. But any kind of a product from 75D plus, you can use for making a hub.
Okay.
Medium hardness between 45D to 60D are all used for making a variety of catheters.
Okay.
If you take an example of cardiac catheters,
Yep.
they have a variable durometer. Right at the hub, they have pretty hard kind of higher hardness of the polymers between 60 to 72D.
Yep.
Then if you go in the middle section, they may have any place from 45D to 55D. And right at the end, the distal end, they may use softer version of it. Many of those urethane catheters made out of 80A durometer to 60 the durometer, 55 to 60 the durometers.
Right.
So medium grades are mostly, the majority of those things used for extrusion, making catheters.
Okay. And then the ultra soft materials on like the distal end would be
right. The distal end could go ultra soft, but also ultra soft material like silicone or softer polyurethane they use for low pressure balloons.
Yeah.
And bladders and soft tip, because tip is a one where you start touching the tissue. You
Yeah.
want to get as soft as possible.
Right. Atraumatic, less trauma.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I'm glad that you brought up silicone because I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between a thermoplastic and a thermoset. If you can talk a little bit about the difference between a thermoplastic and a thermoset, and then we can talk a little bit about some in polarity and some of the secondary operations related to assembly. You can kind of talk about the difference there.
Okay. Well, thermoplastic as terminology itself, it says heat plastics. So it's when you heat them, they will soften and melt it. It has a melt flow.
Mhm.
You can cool it down, make a solid part, and you can reheat again. So thermoplastic is you can reuse those things by reheating versus the thermoset in single use application.
Okay.
Once the thermoset get completely cross-linked, you cannot reheat or you cannot reuse. So if you made a wrong parts or something went wrong, you need to get rid of it. Thermoplastic, you can regrind and reuse those products. So you must have also heard there's a lot of big push in the recycling of this plastics. Those are all thermoplastic parts,
Yes.
which they can recycle and reuse into the less demanding applications.
Yeah, you brought up a good point about the materials. Thermoplastics can be remelted. So earlier, you're talking about like a variable durometer shaft where you have stiff materials or hard on the proximal end and soft materials on the distal end, and different extrusions laid up on a mandrel, for instance, reflowed together. That's something
Right.
you can do with a thermoplastic materials, but not something that you can do with the thermoset materials.
Exactly right. That is correct.
Okay. Also, one of the when you think about assembling devices, we just talked about the example of reflow and with thermoplastics, but in most thermoplastics, if they're compatible, they can thermally bond together.
Right. Again, I think there are two kinds of compatibility happens.
Hmm.
Uh, I'll give you example. If you take any polyurethanes material, and if you want to combine those materials with polyurethane, it will work well. However, you are going to combine those with PTFE or even for that matter, another thermoplastic like polyethylene or polypropylene, it will not combine together. And that has to do with, polarity of the plastics. Uh, some some polymers are very highly polar material, which are mostly reacted by a condensation reaction like polyamides or polyurethanes or
Hmm.
polycarbonates or things like that. And some polymers are completely non-polar or hydrophobic.
Hmm.
Polyethylene, polypropylene, PTFE is a prime example of it. But so what just happens is that's where all the positive and negative charge is completely neutralized. There is no positive, negative charge. And water also doesn't form a nice bead.
Yeah.
Polymer will not wet. Versus if you have polar materials, uh, negative and positive charge are not equal.
Yep.
So some of them are positively polar, some are negatively polar. Water will be wetted well, and it will also stick to each other, heat bond to each other very well.
Okay.
So it's true, the thermoplastic can be melted and remelted, but you want to make sure if you want to heat bond something, then you use a similar polar material polar material. It will bond very well than if you have non-polar material to the polar material.
If you're working with non-polar and polar materials and you do want to join them some way, I guess you have to have some other process like an adhesive layer or some kind
Right.
of surface preparation, etching, for instance.
Right. So many a times, FEP catheters or polyethylene, polypropylene catheters, you can do the plasma treatment
Mhm.
before you can do any kind of secondary processes.
Okay.
If you can go through the next slide, maybe there's a list of the secondary processes, and maybe we can go through each one of those processes and discuss a little more in detail. Here is where you can see most of the catheters you have to do the injection molding of the hubbing.
Mhm.
And hub molding, you want to make sure it's done by the similar kind of polarity. And if the polarity is not going to match, then you have to do the surface treatment
Mhm.
before you do the proper hub molding. First one is a catheter tipping and curving process.
Mhm.
Here, really, the thermoplastic polymers plays a role, forming a tip and all. You have to melt and cool it down.
Mhm.
And if you want to curve the product, again, you put your catheter into the hot mold, let it take the shape and cool it down in that condition, and it will retain the shape.
Okay.
You mentioned various hardness of catheters. You can combine and make it a one catheter hard to the soft one. That's where also you have to do the surface reflow process
Mhm.
to make sure the top surface is, and this is a good application of the thermoplastic nature of those polymers. Printing, every catheter or every device needs some sort of a printing. And printing is more easier on the polar
Mhm.
polymers. If you're going to be printing on the polypropylene parts or fluoropolymers part or polyethylene parts, you may have to go through some surface treatment
Okay.
before printing. Drilling and skiving. Whenever you drill and skive at the end, you want to make sure the edges are really smooth. And that's where you do the heat treatment or the flame treatment. So the edges are really soften, melt, and reshape, form a very smooth surface. And hydrophilic coating. Most of the cardiovascular catheters go through the hydrophilic coating process, and hydrophilic coating will adhere to the polar surface much more better than any non-polar surface. So thermoplasticity and polarity really plays a role
Mhm.
in the secondary assembly to finishing of the devices.
One of the bullet items there was insert molding, and I know that bonding polymers to metals can sometimes be challenging, right?
That's true. That's true. There are some special primers are out there. If not, they make a surface of the metal a little bit rough, hoping to get the mechanical uh, bonding, but using some primers, which helps. Those are all called the coupling agents,
Okay.
and primers made with certain coupling agent will help. They will, one end of the coupling agent will couple to metals and other to metal nicely, and other end will combine with the type of the polymer you would be using.
Okay. Excellent. Let's move on to processes now. We talked a lot about chemistry and polarity. It was great. Let's move on to processing, and I want to share a screen real quick and kind of focus on, there's different polymer processes here. I'd like to try to focus on liquid processing if we can.
Right. I think here, this slide will have a very quick review
Mhm.
of basically there are three kinds of processes you can do. You can do the heat processing or the melt processing, which is the injection molding or extrusion or wherever the thermoplastic processing
Mhm.
can be done that way. Right in the middle is a solid state processing. That's where you make a film or the polymer tubing as a
Mhm.
feedstock. And the film, you can do different kind of welding to make a bags or whatever shape you need.
Yep.
All the secondary processing we discussed in the previous slides, those are all the solid state processing, where you take a catheter tubing and process it further, either with the heat or with the printing or whatever else.
Okay.
And in the liquid state processing, there are two basic kind of liquid processing. First is really either a pre-polymer or a reactive monomer.
Mhm.
Itself, you can finish off the reaction. Those are the high viscous materials, especially silicone.
Yep.
Is a liquid injection molding or the rim reaction injection molding. Those processes fall under the liquid processing, thermoset kind of chemistry they
Yep.
use.
Right.
And the second kind of liquid processing is really the solution and the dispersion
Mhm.
of the polymers, either thermoplastic or fully reacted thermoset polymers.
Yep.
Those are dip molded, spray coated, or spin casting. There are a number of different ways you can process those things. Dip molding is really a very much used in making a various devices.
Okay.
Here is a very quick schematic of dip molding. Is nothing but you can have a mandrel, you can dip mold, dip into the polymer solution, spin around to get the uniform wall thickness, withdraw from the liquid, let it dry. The solvent will be evaporated.
Okay.
Sometimes you have to heat bake and demold that pieces. Stent covering is also been done by this way instead of mandrel. You can put the stent on the top of the mandrel, and that entire stent you use as a mandrel and dip it into the liquid and have the thin coating and or the dip coating process. Spraying, people are doing the air spray or the ultrasonic spray. Most of the drugs, the device nowadays, a drug is very much used as a drug coated devices.
Yep.
And all those drugs in the precise quantity applied over stent. It's by ultrasonic spray method.
Okay. This dipping process, what polymers can be solutionized for that dipping process?
Most of the times, polyurethane, lower hardness of polyurethane or low to mid hardness of polyurethanes are used for solutionize in the THF or DMF or any of highly polar solvent, and they use it. Second popular polymer is thermoplastic TPE, where styrenic materials, ACBS or SPS kind of polymers they use, and they make a very low pressure balloon it's all the synthetic latex,
Right.
because the latex is very elastic, very high elongation. But since latex having an allergic reaction, everybody's looking around replacement of the material which has 1,000+% elongation.
Yeah.
And some of those styrenic polymers have more than 1,000% elongation.
Okay.
Second, polymers you also use is a silicone,
Okay.
which comes under the liquid form. So, but you still have to add solvent to really adjust the viscosity. So it's further solubilized to make it a suitable viscosity to make sure it usable for your dip coating application.
Okay. In extrusion, it's very difficult to extrude thin wall tubing below, let's say, a thousandth of an inch, maybe thou and a half, but thousandths of an inch, that's tough in an micro extrusion process. What kind of wall thicknesses can be achieved in the solution or dip coating process?
I think typically dip coating process 1,000 is pretty normal. Typically, people go with a balloon 2-3 mil
Yeah.
thickness, but many a times people need less than a 1 mil thickness. We use either spin casting process, where you drop the polymer solution onto the spinning disc,
Mm-hmm.
and that will create this thing. Or we can also use a spray process, where very thin spray, you can have a few microns layer of coating.
Okay.
So the dipping can give you 1 mil is a limit. If you go less than a mil, you have to have a very special high molecular weight of polyurethane, and mandrel design has to be such that while the demolding, you don't deform.
Gotcha. Okay. In this dip coating process, one of the things I'm curious about in med tech manufacturing is scaling, right? From prototype to high volume production. Does the dip coating process lend itself well for scaling?
It can, but it can also become pretty expensive, because every single piece requires a single, mandrel. And dip coating process itself takes a long time. You have to dip the mandrel. Sometimes to build the thickness, you have to dip 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
In between the dip, you need to dry. So whole dipping cycle can be, instead of few minutes, it can become 15, 20 minutes or more.
Mm.
After you finish dipping to build the whatever thickness you want, now you have to dry it at room temperature for a couple of hours, and then under the heat to get rid of last drop of solvent, trace of solvent from the part. So typically people dry overnight, and then you have to demold from the mandrel. So it's so many different steps. Process is very long, but think about it. All the latex gloves are made by the dip coating process.
Yes.
And the dipping line are 1,000 feet long.
Yeah.
It requires a lot of room. It goes through the different station and so many, mandrels. So unless you are really in the mass production, and willing to set up a continuous dipping process, then yes, you can do the mass production. Compared to injection molding or extrusion, where you have a tool and its total cycle time is a minute or less, sometimes a couple of minutes is maximum. And in extrusion is a matter of speed. So dipping can be done, but it has to be intentional, and that's the only way to make it. There is no other way than yes.
Yeah. Okay.
One should consider. Breast implants are all dipping process. Gloves and condoms for that reason.
Yeah.
These are all the dipping process. But those are sold in the millions and millions of units.
That must be a sight to see a mass production glove dipping operation. How long?
Yes.
That must be just massive.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Tilak, this has been a real interesting conversation. So grateful for you to join me today to talk about these topics, chemistry and material selection and process selection for medical devices. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to MEDEX, the Medical Extrusion Podcast, presented by US Extruders. Please subscribe to make sure you're getting the latest episodes. For video episodes, go to us-extruders.com/podcasts. All links are available in the show notes.